Hi everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and this is a kind of a follow-up to the video I did yesterday, number 15 in my series where I talked about audio editing in Bitwig versus Ableton. And I had a good question somebody asked about this video. They basically said, this is good, this is great information, but there's still one thing I haven't been able to figure out, and that's how to take any one specific audio event from inside a clip. And if you don't understand the difference between audio event and clip, go watch the previous video number 15 to learn about that. But their question was, how do you take one specific event that might be inside of a clip and turn that into a sample that you could load into some sort of external sampler or third-party VST sampler, or make a sample pack with it, that kind of thing. So I realized it's not that hard to figure out how to make good, clean 24-bit samples for a sample pack. But if you've never wrestled with it before, maybe you're a little stumped how to do it. So I figured I'd kill two birds with one stone and kind of answer that person's question, and also just generally talk about a good workflow, a fast workflow for creating nice, clean 24-bit samples that you can put in a sample pack and share with your producer friends or sell or whatever you want. So here's how to do it in Bitwig. And I pre-built some things so you didn't have to sit through my sound design stuff for this demo. So let me kind of explain what we're looking at here and what our end goal is. I started out with a simple sample in my sample library. This is just something from one of my producer friends. It's a 48 kilohertz. It's a 48 sample rate sample. I usually work in 44.1 for all my music projects. So this was kind of a sample made for film or somebody who felt like they needed to work at 48 hertz, 48 kilohertz. I'll get into that later. I'm probably going to do a blog article about what sample rate to work at later. At any rate, normally I wouldn't start with a 48 kilohertz sample and just drag it straight into my project, because you run into on-the-fly sample rate conversion from your DAW, which is never very good. Usually if you're going to use a sample that's at a different sample rate than your project is set at, well, since I'm using a sound card, stuff you can't really tell my sample rate, but it's 44, you can see right here, it's at 44.1 kilohertz. So usually you don't want to take a 48 kilohertz sample and just drag it into a 44.1 kilohertz project. Instead, you're better off using some third-party utility to convert that sample rate, to downsample it to 44.1 with something that does high-quality sample rate conversion, and then bring it into your project. But in this case, I was going to mangle the sample so drastically it didn't matter. I didn't care about the small errors that sample rate conversion through my DAW would cause, or what kind of CPU load it would put on the DAW. So here's what the sample sounded like in my sample library. Okay, so that's the preview from the sample library. Stop playing it. Here it is after I dragged it into my project, so now we're playing it from the project itself. And the first thing I did was I came in here and I said, I just want to work with this one blip, because it's just two blips. And I want to use this one as the basis for a new sample, for a sample pack, and I'm going to play some games with it and make it very different sounding. So I came in here, and you can select any chunk of time and do Control E to split that audio event into its own chunk within the sample. So I split this event, and then here's a trick you can do. This is kind of answering that person's question on my last video, number 15. How do you take one specific event inside of a larger clip and pull it out and make a sample out of it? So the trick is, in your clip editor, go to track view so that you're seeing, this is a representation of this total track, and in the arranger view, and there's this little small representation of the clip itself here at this top level on the bar here. So if you zoom in a little bit, find the specific audio event you want, and then zoom out so that you have some space next to it on the track here. And then do Control and click drag to drag that audio event outside of the sample. And you can see as soon as I drag it outside of the sample, Bitwig is trying to put it into its own clip. So I'll just drop it there. And now I have a new clip that has, it tried to like line it up with boundaries. Let's get this lined up. Come here, you. Oh, stop that. Okay. So here's this clip. If I zoom out a little bit, drag over, here's the other clip, right? So you can come in here and you can kind of get rid of the other clip by focusing on just this one clip that's selected. See, if I'm in clip mode, whichever one of these I select, it just jumps to show the contents of that clip. Okay, so that's a nice way to just jump around and get right into the details of any clip in your track. So I made this new clip that just had this one short event in it. And then consolidating it won't really change anything because underlying here is still the full original sample. If I were to go into track mode, for example, and zoom in a little bit here, if I take this sample and drag it out to the edge of the boundary, you'll see there's still information there, right? And if I were to make this clip even longer, you see I could still drag that sample out until I find the second blip, right? So consolidating it alone won't really change that. If I take this clip and I do, Control J to consolidate, all that information is still there, hiding underneath. This is stuff that I talked about in the last video about audio editing, but I'm just reviewing it for you here. See, that second blip is still there. So the thing you really want to do to make sure this is an entirely new clip with the audio event limited to just the thing you wanted to capture, the thing to do there is, and let me make this shorter, by the way, kind of duplicate how I got to where I am there. All right, so we're gonna right click this one clip and do bounce. And here's the trick. I want you to always remember this. When you're doing resampling inside of your project, always use a 32-bit floating point for your bounces. Pre-fader 32-bit. It isn't until you're going to make your final sample for a sample pack that you want to convert the bitrate downward to your target bitrate of either 24 or 16. In most cases, you want 24. So you only do a 24 on the very last bounce that you're ready to capture as a sample for your sample pack, or as a sample to load into your sampler utility, or VST, or a third-party hardware sampler. And if you've got a really old piece of gear, it might require 16-bit samples, so you can downsample that far if you need to, but normally you want to downsample to 24-bit. But until you're at that point, you always want to do your bounces for all your resampling and your processing inside the DAW. Always do it at 32-bit. So I'm bouncing that original sample at 32-bit, and it makes this new track, and here's the new sample right here. Okay, and the reason I did that is so now this thing is truly one short sample, and it's a new bounced sample in my project. It's brand new. There's nothing on either side of it. If I make the clip longer and try to drag this out, it's just empty space. In fact, it won't even go farther than that, right? So this is what you want to start with when you're cutting out a tiny little clip of an audio event, pulling one audio event out into its new sample, is get it all set up here and then bounce it out at 32 bits to a new sample. And then from here, you can start working on the rest of your process. So zooming back out a little bit, that's how I got to a preliminary step for this sample is I made this bounce here. Then that's effectively what started here, but then I did some stretching. So the first thing I did to this sample was I stretched it. So if we double click this clip and let's get back into clip mode so it's zooming in on the specific part of the clip I want. And we look over here in the inspector, you'll see that every time you do a bounce, let's throw this out if you haven't wrapped your head around this yet. In the settings under behavior, there's this thing about default stretch mode right here. And whenever you record or bounce into your project, it doesn't give you an option. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you the option to choose raw, which means no stretching whatsoever, just leave it raw. For whatever reason, Bitwig thought, let's always, not give them the option of raw, and let's choose stretch by default. Now, that may seem scary. It's like, but I don't want to warp my clips every time I bounce. I don't want them warped. You think, well, if I see stretch here, that's warped, right? But stretch is a very special kind of warping mode. By default, if your sample is at the same exact rate as your project tempo, right? So the sample's tempo is 110. You can see right down here in the inspector. If it's stretch at the original project tempo, there's absolutely no stretching happening. It's ready to be stretched, but it's not actually stretched. This is effectively the same as raw. So don't be alarmed when you bounce something down and you see, as soon as you go in and look at it in the inspector, that down here in the stretching area, it looks like it's stretched. It's not. Not if it's set at stretch and not if it's bounced at the original tempo of the project. Okay, so that may confuse you for a while, but trust me, it's the same exact thing as raw. Until you change some value here, like you change the tempo, this is effectively raw. Okay, so what I did was, here's my raw sample, and it's at a tempo of 110. But then for this clip, the first bit of processing I decided to do to it was to stretch it out. And I used a cyclic stretch mode. So I basically just took this clip. It's as if I took this clip and said, okay, I'm going to use the stretch mode called cyclic, which is the closest thing Bitwig has to Ableton's textures mode. Textures and cyclic are done the same way. They're both a grain type of sampling. Cyclic is not as flexible and full-featured as Ableton's textures, but it's pretty close. So I switched it to cyclic, and then the first thing I did was slow down the tempo, because this is a very classic trick a lot of us use with textures mode in Ableton, is you'll take any given sample and flip it over to textures mode and then slow it all the way down to the maximum of 999, which slows it down, right? It's a very classic technique. So if I were to drag this clip out bigger, you'd see it looks the same as this one over here, right? So that's effectively how I got to this clip, which was simply switched to cyclic and slowed down by stretching it out to a 999 tempo. So what this sounds like, and I need to turn off some further processing I did on that. Let me turn off these two. So here's the original clip that we dragged out, the audio event that we dragged out into its own clip. This is what that sounds like. Okay, here's what it sounds like stretched out. Whoops, I still have my modulation on here too. Try to disable the things I did. Well, I'm going to leave those on there. I stretched it out, and then I went in and I played games with clip modulation, and I played some games with the pitch jumping up and down a little bit over the length of the sample, and I also played games with the format of the sample. So when I was done with those two steps, this sound turned into this sound. Okay, so that's slowed down with cyclic mode, some format and pitch modulation added to the clip itself. And then I also said, well, it's too high frequency. Let's go look at this real quick in a spectrum analyzer. So here's this clip again. Okay, it's all in here. Could be a good bass top, but I kind of wanted to throw in some bass and subby energy here, which this clip is currently lacking. So to do that, I added BX Subsynth, which is it generates harmonics kind of backward from whatever your main fundamentals are. It'll actually work backward and generate matching sub and bass harmonics, mostly in the sub range, like 3 different ranges, 24 to 36 hertz, 36 to 56 hertz, and then 58 to 80 hertz. So this tries to fill in and generate subharmonics based on what it hears in the sample. So when I enable this plugin, and with the settings that I dialed in on this, the waveform's going to look a lot different now. So if you've got headphones on or you're listening on good monitors, you'll hear all the huge amount of sub bass that was added in, right? Then I said I also want to mangle this sound quite a bit. So I used a tool I like called Dumpster Fire. I'm not even going to try and explain this, but Freak Show Industries makes some really cool plugins for creative sound mangling. So with Dumpster Fire enabled, it sounds like this now, and the curve will look a little different. Okay, so that's just one bounce, stretching it and slowing it down, adding in some subharmonics and bass harmonics, and doing some creative mangling with a creative plugin. And so that got me to this state. So then it's very common to play multiple rounds of sampling and resampling when you're doing sound design. So I took this one and I bounced this into this track. So what it looked like when I first bounced it was bounce pre-fader 32-bit. So at first it looked like this. That's how this clip started out. And then all I did was, let me close this for a minute, I slowed it down again. So again, when we look at this in the inspector, it's back to stretch mode at 110, which is my project tempo, which means it's basically raw. It's completely unchanged. It's just a direct bounce from this processed waveform. So from here, I slowed it down again, and I put it into cyclic mode one more time, slowed it all the way down to 999 again, and you can see now that if I make as much room as possible and drag it out, it looks exactly the same as this clip over here. Okay, so that's how I arrived at the basis for this clip. So then I took a listen to the clip, and let me turn off the device processing I have on this track. And I said, you know, this is going to be close to what I want. I want to see if there's something in here that I like and I want to cut out and use as a sample. So pay close attention to the waveform here and pay super close attention to this section of the meter, which is a correlation meter for all 32 bands of the spectrum. And if you see red colors, that means negative correlation in each band. So this sample sounds like this before I did my final finishing and processing. Okay, so it's very mono so far. Why am I seeing mono there? This is bothering me because it should be a lot messier. Let's check my master. I didn't leave this in mono, did I? Yep, I did. My bad. All right, let's look at this one more time. So you can see all this really high correlation, all in these pretty much across the spectrum, right? And it's mostly sub-frequencies right now. It sounds good, right? It sounds good, but it's very badly correlated. So we're going to have some monocompatibility problems. And I especially like this section right about here. Start. So I like this stretch right about here. I'm going to loop on this for a minute. Okay. And I like this. I want to cut this out and use this as a basis for a sample pack. I want to make this like a bass oscillator, a kind of a mid bass that could be used in a layered bass rack, and add a bunch of other layers to create the high-end energy and movement in it. So the problem though is all this red correlation stuff. This means that when I collapse this whole track to mono, it's going to lose a lot of its energy. So let's listen to that and hear that. Clear this off again and watch as this button turns on and off and the little yellow light comes on. Okay, so it's losing too much energy. It's not very monocompatible, so that would make a terrible sample for a sample pack in its current state. But now we're going to fix that. My favorite tool for that is BX Control by Brainworks. And the reason BX Control is nice is it gives you this mono maker knob that will take everything below a certain frequency and collapse it to mono, but or slowly roll it, filter it down to mono kind of. But then it'll leave everything above this frequency untouched. So then it also has a typical mid-side control here. This is just like your width control in Ableton's utility or the width control in Bitwig's tool. This just basically is the balance between the sides over on here and the mid over on this side. So I basically just set a mono frequency up to about this point and pulled made the mid a little bit louder than the sides. Basically rolling it this way is turning down the sides a little bit. So by doing this simple shaping, we fix all those correlation issues and you'll see the correlation looks a lot better and it's also much more mono compatible when I flip in and out of mono. See how there's no red here? And then if I collapse it to mono, okay, so this is how I basically took that sample and made it fairly monocompatible. And then from there, we're ready to actually make a sample. Yay, this is going to be a nice short video. So let's say I want to take this one segment and turn it into a sample for a sample pack. So I pay close attention to where I am on the meters, and maybe I'll just make this start at, make it an even 2-bar sample. So let's loop that and see how it sounds. Roll over a little bit, sorry about that. Okay, why aren't you jumping over there? Because I've got you on. Okay, let's try that again. All right, I hear a little clicking. I hear a little clicking at the end, so we'll fix that before we bounce the final thing. So the way we're going to do this is double-click this clip to edit it. I'm going to grab a section between bars 18 and 20. So we'll zoom in around that area, and I will highlight 18 and 20, and then I'll do Control E to split it. So now I've got a new clip again, a new audio event that's been split out by itself. And I'm going to zoom back out on the timeline a bit. Flip over here into track mode so you can see what's happening a little better. So I'm going to take this clip and just drag it over to a new bar by itself. And if we look here in the arranger timeline, we can see here's our new clip. And I'm going to go into that clip. Okay, so here's the start and end of the clip. And if we zoom in really close, we can see that we're not starting at a zero crossing here. So we need to put a little fade in here to force it to start at a zero crossing. Or I could even say, let's start it right here where we have a, well, there's not really, the correlation's interesting. It's hard to get both channels positive DC. So we'll just do a fade and do it that way. So I'm going to come in here. Actually, I'm just going to grab the entire event and select it by clicking the header for the event. And as I talked about in my last clip, my last video rather, if you want to do an auto fade, that's going to put these tiny little micro fades. I'm zoomed in very far, and if we look over here at the fade section for this audio event, it's a little 0.07 fade with a nice curve to it. And that effectively just gives us a nice, quiet zero crossing start. And if I jump over to the whole clip, oh, let's find the right one. Did I do the right one? Yeah, there it is. If I jump over to the whole clip and we zoom in on the end, you can see it also put a similar kind of fade at the end. And again, it fades out to a nice zero crossing. So if I play this clip, we shouldn't hear the clicks anymore. Let's loop it so it's actually making a loop. Okay, so that's in good shape for a sample pack. It's mono-compatible. It's got zero crossings at the start and finish, so there's no clicks if somebody wants to loop this sample for some reason. Although I wouldn't use the sample that way. I'd use it as an oscillator and a layered kind of synth patch of some sort. So this is ready to turn into a sample for a sample pack. So the last step we're going to do is click this, right-click it, and do bounce one more time to pull it onto a new track. Oh, before I do that, let's do one other thing that's typically good to check. Over here on my master track, I have a peak limiter, and I just like to make sure that the original sample isn't peaking. So I'm going to watch and see what it does here. I usually make a peak limiter the first thing on my master track, and I set a ceiling a little bit under 0 dB, just to make sure I don't accidentally do some processing that goes way the hell over 0. So we're just going to watch what happens here and make sure that nothing in this clip at its current state is trying to go over 0 and is getting limited somehow. And then after that, I've turned everything down by about 12 dB just for this video. Okay, so it looks good. We're kind of up here. I could even try to gain it up a little bit and ride the line and get it as close as possible to 0, but honestly, it's better to do that later by normalizing the file in a different utility like RX7. So this is in good shape. We're going to bounce it now. Bounce, and since this is the final bounce to make the actual sample for the sample pack, we're going to pick 24-bit, and here's the key. Whenever you pick anything that isn't a floating point bitrate, anytime you pick 24 or 16, you should always dither. I think I have another video in my series on dithering. I'm probably going to write a blog article about dithering next month. I think I'm scheduled to do it. And trust me, you always want to dither because dithering noise is always much, much better than truncation distortion, which is what happens if you convert from floating point to a fixed point without doing dithering. You get what's called truncation distortion. And the tiny, tiny infinitesimal amount of noise you get from dithering is so much better in the long run than truncation distortion. So whenever you go from 32-bit to 24-bit, always dither. And basically, anytime you bounce, your system is doing all of its processing at 32-bit floating point internally. So you can effectively think anytime I'm playing something in my DAW, it's running at 32-bit floating point. So every time you bounce to something lower, you always want to dither. Okay, so final sample, pre-fader 24-bit dither, and then we'll go ahead and bounce that out. And so here's the final sample, and it's a 24-bit sample. It's still, let's see. Yeah, it's a 24-bit sample, and this is what it actually sounds like. And see those fades are baked into it. So if we were to look really close at the beginning, it's effectively a zero crossing there. And if we look really close at the end, it's a zero crossing there. Okay, so everything's baked into it. It's now 24-bit. So the final step is, how do you find the sample and rename it and put it in the folder that's going to be your sample pack, right? So again, you just double click on that file, that clip, your final bounced 24-bit clip. And then you go into the event editor and you select the actual bounced waveform itself. Then you right click on it and choose Open Containing Folder. And then here's the folder for the project where all your bounces are. And all you have to do is pay attention to the name of the specific audio event. It's Audio 7 Bounce 2, which is this file right here. So what I would do at this point if I was making a sample pack is, let's open this in a new window. And let's say I make a special folder for right? And I would take this file and just copy it over into this folder. And then I would rename it. So give it a name that makes sense. And if we look at its properties, Windows is kind of stupid about showing you bit rates, but let's see. Yeah, you have to understand that when you see 2116, that's a 24-bit file. And I don't even think they show you sample rates. So a better way to tell what's going on with your samples is to open it in RX7. And that's on my other monitor, so let's pull it down here. So this is what it looks like, and you can go to Window, File Info, and see that it's 24-bit 44.1. You can also see statistics for the file if you want by going down here to Waveform Stats. And here's the waveform stats. I don't have anything anywhere close to peak. Well, I don't have anything that's clipping. My highest true peak value is just under 0, so that's perfect. My highest sample peak is negative 0.2, so it's just like, it's perfect sample. It's about, I don't even need to normalize it because it's already effectively right at the top of the space you would want to have a sample. So there you go. You just repeat this process as you go, and keep making bounces, keep resampling, make that final bounce a 24-bit. Come down here, right click on it and say, show it to me in the folder. Get your other folder open where you're keeping all your files, and just, take whatever new bounce it might be and copy it over. And you can make a sample pack that fast. A little bit of mangling and processing, get some things that are good and clean. No zero crossings, mono-compatible, sounds good, and you can build a sample pack super fast, just like this. So I hope this has helped. And like with all my videos, if you appreciate the time and effort I put into them, please check out the details below. There's links to my SoundCloud and my Spotify page. I'd love it if you'd listen to my stuff and give me a follow. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.